Powell delivering Jay Powell, his first testimony as Fed chairman of the Financial Services Committee this morning. Joining us now with his expectations from the Fed chief committee chairman, Jeb Hensarling. And I mean, I look at this, and Congressman Chairman, thank you. It's great to see you. I can make a case. I swear, maybe, maybe I'm like a sociopath or something, but I could make a case that we stayed low way too long, and we've hurt savers and banks have benefited, and that they need to get this under control as far as the balance sheet. The Fed, I could make that case. And then I could also make the case that you guys better tread very, very lightly, because the things are good, but you don't want to overshoot in terms of how quickly you do this to cut off what is a pretty good economy. So that's the fine line he has to walk. I think you come down on the normalize these rates. You've been low for too long. Is that where you are?
Well, I would say in some respects, to rephrase maybe what you just said, is Chairman Powell, don't blow it. Yeah, we've got a pretty good thing going now after 8 years of 1.6 economic GDP growth. I mean, now all of a sudden we have the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. We've stopped the regulatory beatings, and guess what? 3% growth is back, which makes a huge difference in the lives of working people. But we know that we did have almost a decade of ridiculously low artificial interest rates. So if you're going to normalize the balance sheet, which I think you need to, now is a good time to do it as we have strong earnings report. So what I'm hoping today in the Humphrey Hawkins hearing is that the chairman will lay out, again, a path to normalization. Obviously, it does need to be gradual, but we have to debate exactly how fast that needs to be done. But what the Fed needs to do is articulate precisely what their path to normalization is, and is there a new normal? It appears that we're on path for a larger balance sheet. I'm not sure this is a good thing. The composition of the balance sheet, will it still be heavy on mortgage-backed securities? There's a lot of questions to be answered.
Do you think that the underlying rate of inflation has hit the targets that are appropriate, that the Fed has outlined, since they have a dual mandate? You can argue whether that's smart or not, but do you think we've actually made it to where they're not undershooting, or we're not undershooting inflation? Is it back to 2%?
Well, listen, it's an excellent question whether or not a central bank ought to have an inflation target in the first place.
Right.
And so we know that the Fed has never hit their 2% inflation target. There's something counterintuitive about having a statutory mandate for price stability and then adopting an inflation target. But at least at 2%, you have a linear function. And now there's talk about having a range. And I'm not really sure how a variable inflation target is commensurate with price stability. And by the way, a modest amount of deflation that results from either technological improvements, innovation, higher productivity, stretching the family paycheck a little further is not necessarily a bad thing. So again, I really question whether or not, number one, we need an inflation target to begin with, much less whether we should move to a variable inflation target. And then as you look at the minutes of the FOMC from 6 minutes ago, again, there's a discussion of turning that into a range, I guess from a stationary target to a moving target. If you can't hit a stationary target, I don't know how you're going to hit a moving target. And then we know that some commentators are calling for even higher levels of inflation. And I do not think this to be a good thing, and those decisions, frankly, ultimately need to be made by Congress. We want to make sure that there is monetary policy independence, but there has to be oversight as well. That's a major change if this inflation target is going to somehow move north of 2%.
If Powell decided to, maybe lecture's not the right word, but let's say Powell decides to point out to Republicans that the deficit approach that they took when Democrats were in power seems to have gone out the window in terms of tax cuts and the new budget and infrastructure and everything else. Is there any merit to that? Do you think the Fed is worried that we've got to 20 trillion and now we're headed to 21 and 22 and upwards from there? Do you think that that's something that should be on their mind?
Frankly, it ought to be on the mind of every American citizen. And unfortunately, we're seeing trillion-dollar deficits as far as the eye can see, and they are structural deficits. So number one, with respect to the Tax Cut and the Jobs Act, if we hit 3% economic growth, this is a tax cut that, quote unquote, pays for itself. And if we look, go back to the Reagan tax cut, the Kennedy tax cut, heck, you can go all the way back to the Coolidge tax cut. They produced either 5 or 4% GDP growth. I think this tax cut can produce the same. But we also know that Congress just voted to get rid of the last vestiges of fiscal responsibility around here, and that was the budget caps and an increase in the debt ceiling with reforms. I voted against it, and I'm very much concerned that ultimately these deficits can drag down the economy. I don't know when. And so at some point, we could see bond markets head a different direction. Now, is that 5 years, 10 years? Is that a generation away? I don't know. But what I do know is my iPad is awash of reports saying our spending trajectory is unsustainable, our debt is unsustainable, and yet it's not getting any better. So yes, should the Fed worry about it? Of course, we should all worry about it, and there's one and only one answer, and that is reform current entitlement programs for future generations. I've spent years studying it. That's the only answer.
Hey, Chairman, I wanted you to weigh in on one of the hot-button issues of the day, which is a number of corporations jumping into the gun debate, specifically Delta, which had severed ties with this, or at least stopped this discount program recently for NRA members, now facing pressure from Republicans in Georgia over a gas tax. What do you think of that?
Well, conveniently, I fly American, so I'm not going to tell Delta how to conduct their business. Listen, we've been through yet another national tragedy. We've had way too many moments of silence on the House floor. Listen, I'm the father of 2 teenagers that go to school every day. I worry about this. And so I'm hopeful that maybe we can break through some of the partisan gridlock, maybe break through some of the typical rhetoric. There's a lot that needs to be done, but listen, a private company is going to adopt their own culture, and people can decide whether or not they want to do business with that company. It's still a relatively free society. But I will say that as sacrosanct as the First Amendment is, so is the Second Amendment. So is the Third, so is the Fourth. I mean, this is ingrained in the Constitution. Right. It is in our DNA. There's much we can do. We've got to keep guns out of the hands of people who are basically evil and mentally disturbed. And as a society, you know, there's much that the federal government can do, but it's state government, it's local government, it's parents, it's teachers. And as a society, it is time to stop the carnage.
But, Chairman, you said companies should be able to do what they want, but then we're seeing how the political universe in terms of Republicans in Georgia specifically may now effectively punish them for that. Is that appropriate or not?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what you mean by punishment. If they choose not to fly Delta, they ought to have the privilege not to fly Delta. I mean, there's certain companies that I choose not to do business with.
Oh, no, this is specifically about a tax benefit or not that Delta would or would not get, and as a function of their withdrawal of the discount, that help may not be there.
You're talking about a matter that I don't know anything about. I'm sorry, I don't know what tax matter this is.
It was pressure from the New York Times and social media that got the company to not.
I read the Wall Street Journal and the Dallas Morning News.
It just depends on if you like the pressure because it does what you want to happen in your own mind, then it's okay. If it's not,
that's why I'm curious, sort of.
All right, Mr. Chairman, thanks.
Thank you.
Quick programming.